So I hope you all enjoyed your first summit sessions, and you've had lots of great conversations, and you're walking away with some great takeaways. So next we've got the panel discussion, and Pran here is the founder of the Teacherist and Decolonise the Curriculum, and the conversation is going to be around, is anti-racism relevant in all white spaces? So I'm going to hand you over to Pran to introduce the panel.
I was just about to say good morning, everyone. But it is afternoon. And as a former teacher myself, I'd expect everyone to say afternoon to me. So good afternoon, everyone. Today seems like it's been steeped in power. It's great to see so many faces here who are committed to change, who've taken their first step in just being present. Now, onto the introductions, and I'm going to start. I am a former school leader. I lead a campaign and website called Decolonise the Curriculum, all talking about the structures and the epistemic structures within the curriculum and how we're taught to uphold oppressive structures within our society. And we are all here to do that. Before we start, I want to define two words going forward in this panel. And the first one is white supremacy. And Nick alluded to this morning. White supremacy is often seen as burning crosses, lynching, and violence. I like to define white supremacy as any act or any inaction which leads to the denigration of the lives of people of colour. When we talk about racism, racism is systemic, and that is the frame I want to take. Racism is global and it is systemic, which means it does not flow in the reverse direction. People of colour cannot be systemically racist to white people. We're here to change the structures and the systems which oppress. Now, on to introductions. If we start furthest away from me.
Hello, it's on, that's a good sign. I'm Hannah Chandisingh. I work for the NHS, so University Hospitals of Morecambe Bay, which covers a lot of Cumbria and North Lancashire as well. And my role is a race equality transformation lead, so my entire focus is pushing this agenda.
Hi everyone, I'm Shelley Hayward. I work for the Cumberland Building Society, and my role there is looking after learning and culture and talent development for the business.
Does that one work? Yes. Hi everyone, my name is Dan Barton. I work for the County Council in Cumbria. If you ask my daughter what I do, it means that I sit on my chair and tell people what to do. In actual fact, it's a bit more complicated than that, but I'm here not as an expert in this agenda, but as someone who has a leadership role and is happy to step into that space and be vulnerable with it. So that's why I'm here today. Thanks.
Hello everyone, my name is Sonny Peart and I'm here as a co-founder and trustee of Black Trail Runners, which is a community and campaigning charity that aims to increase the participation, inclusion and representation of Black people in trail running.
Hi, my name is Sally Elton-Chalcraft, and I'm a professor of social justice in education at the University of Cumbria, so just down the road. And I'm here because I'm a teacher educator, and my specialism is in anti-racism, so I'm particularly interested in how we can think about anti-racism in schools and higher education institutions.
Hi, my name is Phyll, also known as Lady Phyll. My day job, I will say, is I lead an LGBT international human rights charity that works to uphold human rights for LGBT plus people across the globe. And my gay job, I guess it would be called, is I am the co-founder and executive director of UK Black Pride, which doesn't only look at the issues of racism, but looks at things through an intersectional lens to make sure that we are challenging racism, homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, and other forms of discrimination that impact our lives.
So let's start the panel discussion off with the first question, or the main question, which is anti-racism relevant in all white spaces? And this is fun, because I've been on the other side. You're like, oh, where's he coming? Can we start with Dan in the education space? I'd also really like to commend you there for being really open with the fact you are here in a vulnerable state and you're here in a learning state. So please be as honest as possible.
Thanks, Pran. So obviously, like any good educator, I thought that you might ask me the question. So I thought, should I prepare an answer? And then I thought, God, I don't know. There's so many questions that are thrown up by that one question. The first answer is kind of, well, yeah, obviously. But then I think you need to dig below it a little bit. And obviously, I think in this room, we've got a lot of people in here who will obviously be here because they think that anti-racism is relevant in all white spaces. But, you know, some questions might be, what is an all white space? Is it something which is designed or which occurs? Why is that? But I think for me, the key bit is, well, we live in this, I mean, there's so many answers to this, and I'll try not to waffle on and perhaps might come back to it a bit later on. But I think, you know, in the age of social media and the idea of the echo chamber, if you don't talk about anti-racism in an all-white space, because why is it relevant? Because there's no black or brown people here, for example, and, you know, look at Cumbria and its kind of ethnic makeup, then all you do is you perpetuate what has always existed. So the first thing for me is, why wouldn't we talk about it? Why isn't it relevant? Because of course it is. And as an educationalist, you know, if we only talked about what is contextually relevant locally, then we wouldn't learn anything new. We wouldn't know about the rest of the world. And there's another kind of key reason there. And I suppose another thing to touch on is around what sort of world we want the world to be, which is why I think most people who are in education went into education in the first place, is to make a change. And if we don't have that conversation, and our children who are in that echo chamber in Cumbria don't get exposed to a narrative which is potentially slightly challenging and different, you know, many people will go out into the world outside of Cumbria and will be shocked and surprised by what they see and hear. And I think it behoves us, you know, morally, to give our children and young people the opportunity to interact with this conversation. I think it's the beginning, the first step to making a better world. And it sounds a bit cheesy, but I think that's why most people go into education. So, I will stop talking, because otherwise I won't. I'll just dominate for the whole time. But I think, you know, that's a few little starters to the question for me.
Thank you. And something's just come to my mind. It's really good that people would like to show the gratification or agreement through clapping, but just to be as inclusive as possible, could we, instead of clapping, can we wave our hands? I can see some people are waving their hands, just for those of us with sensory needs. And also it doesn't stop the flow of the discussion. So moving on to business. So look at it. Shelley, do you mind talking about all white spaces in business and anti-racism, what that looks like?
Yeah, sure. I can certainly speak about it from the perspective of the Cumberland. The simple answer for me is yes. The hard thing is keeping it relevant, because for us, we embarked on our anti-racist journey as an organisation off the back of the football. A simple communication out to the organisation saying, this goes against everything that we stand for as an organisation. Who's up for talking more about it? And that created a lot of conversation for us, where we then got Janet and the team from Anti-Racist Cumbria into the business. It was a real bottom-up swell of people. There was concern, there was worry, there was people concerned of saying the wrong things, of coming into those spaces. But what we evidenced in a completely white, predominantly white space, yes, we've got black and brown colleagues that came along, but the conversation was safe, it was open, and it's created change for us. And it will remain relevant. There are colleagues that have got off their backsides and they've created communities. Andrew, who is over there, he's setting up an anti-racist community group within the business. It's surprised our senior leaders as to the relevance of it. I think we think in business about, we were just chatting about this before, about equality, diversity, inclusivity is this big swell without needing to really hone in on the topics that are really challenging and really hard to talk about, but without that, you can't move the needle, you can't change things. And as an organisation, we don't want to be part of that. We want to be part of the change. We want our colleagues to know that they can create that. It doesn't need to be something that senior leaders in business, we tend to wait for the top to go, yeah, it's okay for us to say this, to believe in it. We've got a policy, so it makes it okay. It doesn't need to be that, and we've proved that in the Cumberland, that people getting together with the right space can make it relevant, keep it relevant, and start to create a bit of change.
Don't give the mic away yet. I just want to push you a little bit on that.
Yeah.
When you talk about making it relevant and keeping it into a safe space, what was specifically done? Because there are people here who want to, I assume, go back to their organisations and think, what can we actually do? And what are there any tips moving forward with that?
Yeah, so we embarked on 2 workshops with Janet. The first one was about the topic of racism, and it simply asked us to really think about what that was and our part in that, to really look within ourselves, to think about the times when we've been that. The second workshop, which was a week later, was about us embarking on that process of being anti-racist. So the model that was shown earlier and is in the bags, it was asking us to really think about where we were and how we were going to make the shift. It was funny because it was 3 parts to it, but we paused on the third one just for a number of reasons. But Janet and I were saying it was actually a good thing that we did, that we had that pause, because it was really moving. Just 2 workshops, 1 hour each, where we got over 300 colleagues in a space to talk or to just listen. There was tears, there was laughs, but just more importantly, there was a connection between people of, we're together on this, we've got allies, and the conversation kept going, and it hasn't stopped since. And that was just 2 one-hour workshops. Yeah.
And moving on to Hannah, who's obviously, I'd like to push you on taking that further organisationally within the NHS, I assume.
So I'd answer the question with another question, I suppose, which is, why is your space all white? I can say, working in the NHS, obviously one of the most diverse organisations that we have in the area. Cumbria, we are in you, we are here. I think a lot of the people in this room will hold their hands up and say, yeah, we're here, we're in Cumbria. And if you've got an all-white space, yeah, there may be reasons for that. What are you doing to perpetuate that? Have you thought about that? Have you thought about what actions you have taken, which actually mean that in the next 10 years, you're still going to have an all-white space. Do people feel welcome to come and join you? Are you making active steps to make sure that people do feel like they can join you? And I think, particularly in Cumbria, a lot of people who have lived there all their life, I hear from people saying, "Oh, we haven't got a problem with race. We don't really have anyone not white who's living here," and it's just wrong. It's just wrong. I see you. I see the people who are here, and you're not being called into spaces. Not being called into those spaces. Those spaces aren't welcoming enough. They're not doing enough for you. So I push it back really to anyone who thinks they're in an all-white space as to what you're doing to make that space all white.
Yeah, really, really good question. I'm not going to answer it. It's interesting. What comes to mind is this idea of an all-white space. I think what we need to do is start moving our thinking toward the ideology that we all adopt. And the terminology is whiteness. We can inhabit and espouse whiteness as the absolute norm of success and safety. And that's what we need to start breaking down. So I absolutely agree. What are we doing to eradicate whiteness as the norm in places? Because all that does is it signifies danger and anxiety for people of colour. Sonny, do you want to take that question in all white spaces? Why is anti-racism important?
Well, at the risk of repetition, the answer is yes, but obviously it's a little bit more than that. So I think there absolutely is a role for anti-racism in all white spaces, and I'm speaking particularly about outdoor spaces, so trail running, cycling, swimming, mountain climbing, skiing. These are all sports which are very, very white. And the reasons that anti-racism is necessary in those spaces is that they are white because of a legacy and in some cases a perpetuation of racism and the kind of systemic racism that Nick was talking about this morning. Lack of access to property, to formal forms of finance, to housing of a certain quality, informal segregation in terms of where people can live and work, which, yes, is not or has not been of the nature, of the legitimized nature that it was in America, but still very, very powerful in this country and of recent date. And so we're still feeling its effects. And as well as that, it's the fact that these outdoor sports are themselves extremely beneficial. As a trail runner myself, and I'm sure we've got some Phyll runners in the audience, the reasons that we engage in these activities is because they improve our physical and our mental health. That's some of the reasons. So we understand these things as being good things. And they will only become spaces which are representative of our whole community. And I'm conscious that, here in the Lake District, this is a national park. It's not a local park. These spaces will only become representative when people are actively anti-racist and do things which are specifically designed to invite people of colour into those spaces. I'm minded of the sort of description of the British Empire as having been created in a fit of absent-mindedness. And that's kind of what some of these spaces are like. It's not that people in them right now are saying, stay out, black people. It's that they often just haven't thought about it. That's something that we've discovered at Black Trail Runners. When we've talked about this, when we've gone on to media, into social media, broadcast media, etc., and started raising some of these issues, one of the overwhelming responses we get is, oh, I just haven't thought about that. It never even crossed my mind. And I can understand it, because as a black person growing up in the UK in the 70s, 80s, I didn't really think about it either. I'm from a mixed race family. I'm fortunate enough to have a good education, a good job. I own a house. I have a British passport. I'm male. I'm heterosexual. I'm married. I'm middle-aged. All of these things kind of shield me from some of these issues. And add to that the fact that I've spent my whole life pretty much being the only black person in the room. Again, as Nick talked about, the only one in my school, the only one in my college at university, often the only one in the room at work. It's just become normalised for me. So I actually had to have my eyes open to it as well. When it was first brought to my attention by a race director, and I mean a running race, not a race director, that of the thousands of people who had entered his races, he could count on one hand the ones who were black. I was actually, well, it wasn't that I was surprised, it was that I just thought, why didn't I know that? I kind of, I'm quite a slow runner, so I'm often at the back in races, so I just kind of assumed there were some fast black dudes at the front, right? But apparently not. I was the only one, and that's what we found to be consistently true. I actually do speak for a living as a lecturer, so I'm going to stop before I just carry on, because my lectures are generally 50 minutes long, so I could take the whole session. Sorry.
Thanks for that. And I think it's really important. Something that really resonated for me is this intentionality. In a lot of my work, intentionality is almost seen as an excuse, a justification. Damage is damage regardless of what our intentions are. We have to be intentional in the damage we write, regardless. And there to Lady Phyll.
Gosh, I've forgotten what the question was. This is so good, I was listening. So, look, my comrade said it, why are there white spaces? But I guess some of this is about structure. And when we talk about structural and systemic racism, these are those systems of oppressions that exist. So you have to look at the root causes of why we are dealing with issues of racism, whether this is politically, whether this is economically, whether this is, individual racism that attacks the individual. And we see it in workplaces, any number of institutions where those spaces are historically white because there is a toxic legacy. And I think that, you mentioned empire. When you think about empire, when we talk about these things, for my white comrades here in this audience, there should be no such thing as guilt, because guilt is self-indulgent and it serves no purpose. This is really about that uncomfortable and unpacking and also unlearning. This is not just about learning, but the unlearning of the behaviors that we find ourselves, existing in or coexisting in, which are harmful. So yes, the simple answer is yes, we do need to ensure that our white comrades are speaking with each other. Racism is not my issue. It's something that harms me and other black and brown people. It should be the issue of my white comrades to ask themselves, what are we doing to disrupt racism? How are we having the conversations about what anti-racist really looks like, as opposed to just saying, I'm not racist? It's easy to say I'm not racist, but it's hard to look at how to disrupt racism. And that disruption can look like anything from protests to roundtable conversations to sitting with family and having maybe gentle conversations, not ones which feel combative, or it could be in your workplaces. And I say in your workplaces when you feel safe and comfortable about doing that, because I also understand people are at different grades, different levels, and actually the workplace or environment may not feel conducive for that level of conversation. but it's about disrupting systems of oppression which harm us. And yes, white people should be speaking to themselves about how to be an ally, should be speaking to each other about how to disrupt, speaking to each other about what solidarity really looks like, and speaking to each other about what actions you take. And I'm not trying to sit here and sound like the angry black woman, and I don't want anyone to give me that title, although I can be angry, and I have got a right to be angry as a black woman who has suffered through the hands of those that harm us. And it's not just me, this is a generational trauma that's placed upon us. If you can give me a minute, somebody asked me on my way, well, somebody asked me, let me not, because I might put them on blast. They asked me the question, can you tell me your experience of racism? And can you actually tell me what levels of racism you've experienced? I said, this is not for me to unearth my trauma and leave it here on the table when there's no one that's going to be able to look after my mental health and well-being when I unearth the discrimination and hate that I have felt. What you should be asking, in a way, is what sort of resources can I have to be a better anti-racist? You know, and I'm looking at my professors to the side of me. She's got some amazing books here. And that's what you do. You know, I heard in the previous panel, Google is your friend. It absolutely is. Find ways to think about, what does critical race theory mean? Find ways to really unpick and unpack and delve deeper, but don't ask questions for me to quantify what levels of racism I have experienced when being in spaces which are predominantly white. And I loved Dan's, explanation about what are white spaces. I guess it's every space, because when you do not hold the balance of superiority, and this is where racism comes from, this social construct, you will always be in spaces that feel predominantly white unless you create them. As my great doctor friend, Dr. Ronk said, you cannot be what you cannot see. And this is why UK Black Pride was created as a resistance to what we didn't see in our wider mainstream LGBT plus movements. They were not talking about how to be anti-racist. They were not talking about the intersections of how our lives meet. They were not talking about how to address some of these inequalities. So UK Black Pride was created from that. And like my colleague, I can talk and talk and talk. And I can't see you if you're going to wink at me to tell me to stop. I cannot see it. So, yeah. You might just need to cough or something. So, yeah, I'll leave it there.
I think real truth to power there. I have to echo those sentiments. When we talk about all white spaces, I want to be clear, racism exists because of white people. People of colour are simply victims in these global structures. And often, I can echo those stories that we're asked to unearth real trauma over and over and over again, which is harmful. I would say if you're sitting in this space and you're thinking, as a white person, what can I do? I would try and analyse through the lens of power. What can I do? What power can I sacrifice to redress and disrupt to that balance? I can see the sudden hush. Oh my God, he said white people are responsible. It's okay. It's okay. Sexism exists because men take that power. It's okay. It's okay to admit and hold that. And it's not going to change until we together accept that. And again, I'm going to start not chairing and talking, so I best move on to Professor Shelley. And do you want to introduce the double barrel, because I don't want to get it wrong?
No, that's all right. Thank you. And hasn't it been great listening to all these panel members so far? Let's just give a little wave of our hands. I think that's been tremendous. Thank you very much. And of course, we've all practiced this, over and over. Not, but it's actually led quite nicely for me to take on the guilt as a white person, but also in seriousness, what I have to say in answer to the question, I will answer using my trusty friends, my books, because as a professor, you don't go anywhere without your books and your sticky labels. And what I'd like to start with in answering the question is this idea of positionality, because we've got to think about our own views, our own position. And one of the things that I've taken from this book, which some of you may well be familiar with, Me and White Supremacy by Layla Saad, is all about this idea of the existence of white supremacy. And she says, it's not, racism is not the shark, it's the water. And it links in with what some of the other panel members have said, this idea that, sometimes it's unconscious. White people are unconscious, what Joyce King calls disconscious racism, not aware of it. A lot of the people who are like me, who are white, just not aware of it. I'm not nasty, they say. White supremacy is in existence. With my student teachers, I use this example. Look at the colour of plasters, Sorry, but, and so this exists. So our positionality, we need to accept the fact and acknowledge that white supremacy exists. And then the barriers, as some of the other panel members and you've said, is that there is this problem with white people, and a person who's written a lot about this is Robin DiAngelo, White Fragility. So we need to do our homework, as you've said, and we need to look at these books, look at Google and so on. And Robin DiAngelo, she talks about white fragility and all the issues that throws up. And another really good one, who's read Mallory Blackman's Noughts and Crosses? That's an excellent one to do with children. So I work with student teachers who are going to go out into schools, and I say to them, work through this. This is the best form of anti-racism, through story. And there's a fantastic, very, very moving, very powerful drama on that as well. So I'd just like to spend a moment, if you wouldn't mind. Can I read a bit from this book? So Robin DiAngelo talks about positive assumptions. Being good or bad is not relevant. Racism is a multi-layered system embedded in our culture. Racism is complex. Something that somebody mentioned earlier, the antidote to guilt is action. And that's what I'm trying to help us with today, because I'm very much a solutions person, and I talk about that with my student teachers. So the barriers are white fragility, risk-taking, conformity, and so on. But the solutions are a development of our own understanding, our own professionalism, and so on. And moving out of our comfort zone, talking about what Janet's put on that little sheet, and thinking about how to be anti-racist. And again, some solutions are minimising white people, particularly our defensiveness, demonstrating our vulnerability, which Dan did, demonstrate our curiosity and humility, allow for growth, stretch our world view, understand other people, taking off your own shoes and putting on the shoes of somebody else, understanding, ensuring action, demonstrating we practice what we profess to value. Somebody was very honest and confessing what had happened to her at some traffic lights where she was being abused, and in the earlier session, and people have talked about that. But building authentic relationships and trust and being white allies, and that's a very important concept that you can look up later. Interrupting privilege, which Lady Phyll has talked about, which protects us from our own comfort, and interrupting internalized superiority. So just you know, have a look at some of these books, and I'm going to be around for a while afterwards, you know, just come and have a look at them. These are some textbooks that I've written with a colleague, my own book on teaching religious education creatively, and there's some work on anti-racism in that. A study that I did about children's awareness of race, and a lovely little phrase from that was, I was speaking to a dual heritage little boy, and he said, "I'm orange," you know, so it's thinking about all these sorts of ideas. And finally, Babette Brown has done a lot of work, as have I, on using persona dolls with early years children, and I talk to my student teachers about that, where you can actually explore issues of racism. I've got a wonderful persona doll that I sit on my knee called Jatinder. He's a little Sikh doll, and he talks to the children about being bullied in the playground, and the children then sort of can identify, oh yeah, I was bullied because I wore glasses, or yeah, I was bullied because of my ethnicity. And you talk through some of these ideas with children to try and unearth where the views come from and upskill teachers in what I call contained risk. So controversial issues can be talked about in a contained risk-taking. And a final book, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, because a lot of black people are giving up on us, so we've got to do as much as we can. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take this conversation onto those two words, white fragility, that uncomfortableness, that feeling of, I'm a good person, and all the distraction that comes from that. Robin DiAngelo sums it up really well, and also, if anyone's really interested, the work of Frantz Fanon is really worth exploring. In my own experience as an activist in the field, white fragility and this tendency to centre on white feelings and the white need for comfort perpetuates and permeates racism. It is the single biggest barrier to change. I just think it'd be really interesting to open the panel up to feelings around that, either on how we as activists and change makers and people in power, do we ameliorate the impact of white fragility without losing the power of and the importance of the message. I'd just like to really hear your perspectives on that. I'd just open it up, just pick the mic up. Dan, do you want to go?
Sorry, did you put your hand up? I wasn't looking that way. I think there's something I wanted to, a couple of things which have really resonated about the kind of call to action almost. So, you know, let's talk, great, but, you know, what we're going to leave here today set up to do. But I thought I'd just kind of narrate a couple of experiences that I've had in my short journey. And that question about white fragility, I think, is really key. And, you know, we've all got Facebook, and, you know, we'll be connected to people from when we used to go to school who we didn't really associate with, but we're, you know, they're friends on Facebook. And I sort of, you kind of you see what people write, and quite often you'll just ignore it. And I think there's something about taking the conversation to people and talking about it. And I got into a sort of a Facebook argument with a guy who I went to secondary school with, who I haven't seen for 35 years. And he was sort of saying, well, I'm not privileged. You know, I lived in Warner's End. You know, that was not privileged. And I was poor. You know, and it's that sort of, that conversation about, it's not about you, it's about the structure. And I found that to be really a powerful sort of happening and an understanding for me. But also the realisation that if we keep sort of turned in on ourselves and on our group of people that all agree with us, you know, in this room, I'm sure most people agree with each other about this conversation. So I think there's something about what action you can take to actually deliberately enter into the conversation with people who you know probably disagree with you, and continue to have that conversation. And actually, I think doing so publicly, be it, you know, in person or on social media, is a really important duty that we all share. And I think the other thing as well is that in this room, you know, both in the audience and around this sort of circle of sofas is there are some people with a lot of power, you know, and I look at myself and I'm not guilty about it, but I won life's lottery in the kind of tall white male thing, but that's something that I'm in a really powerful position, and I can use that to do good things and to step out and, you know, invite Janet to come and talk at my management team meeting, and, you know, there are things that I can do to help create cultural change. So I suppose that's, I mean, again, all of us are going to want to just keep talking every time we get the mic, but this is a couple of thoughts about positive actions that we might take forward.
Hannah, do you want to then on to Sonny?
Yeah, sure. So I think the work that I do in the NHS, obviously we have a really, really diverse workforce, but where we're not diverse is in our leadership. And a lot of what I do is calling people out and calling people in. So I come up against a lot of defensiveness, people who are in positions of power who think, if I admit that there's a problem here, it shows that I've done something wrong. So I have to maintain there's no problem here. Very, very defensive. And for me, the only way to combat that is to call those people in. So yeah, I've said there's a problem. We can see that in the stats. We can see that in what people are telling us. But we all, you included, want this to be a good place to work. We want to be happy here, don't we? So this is all of our responsibility, and I'm calling you into this fight to make a change. And it's really hard to get that balance because I'm angry, you know. I'm really angry about where we are, and I'm angry about the things that people tell me that they're experiencing in the organisation and other places. But in the role that I have, I've got to be compassionate with that person, to listen to them, really have that conversation with them, because otherwise they're going to continue to be defensive. They're not in the same place that I am yet. They're not in the same place that probably most of us are in this room yet. And being able to have that compassionate conversation to talk about what's going wrong, that it's not them specifically that's caused us to get to this point, but it's them that can do something to change it from this point. That's, I think, where we can all make a change. And I find as well, there are not many people in the sort of HR space that I'm in who aren't white, certainly in this area. And having other people be in that room, speak up about it as well, that's huge. I certainly find a lot of defensive white people in positions of power are much more likely to listen to another white person. And I don't like that, but it's true. It's true. And that's where, you know, the people in this room can make a difference.
That was really good. I'm just going to say a couple of things before I pass the mic to Sonny. Dan talked about privilege and what privilege is. Privilege isn't about what you've experienced, it's about what you haven't experienced. So we can talk about poverty all we want. White people don't face systemic racism. It's as simple as that. So I think it's really, really important. When we talk about whiteness in HR and the safety that comes with being white in challenging, for a person of colour to challenge in this space, we are literally putting our very existence on the line. It's a dangerous space where if you have that privilege, I personally would say it's our responsibility and duty to disrupt, because we don't have that trauma you don't have that trauma that's incorporated into that. Sorry, Sonny.
So just before I say what I was going to say, just on that point, I think another issue is that there often aren't any black people in those spaces. And one of the things that you can do is make sure that there are, because there are some really ridiculous decisions that clearly would never have been made if there had been a black person in the room. But going back to your point about sort of white fragility and defensiveness, I think it's one of the things that Robin DiAngelo talks about is sort of this denial of there being an issue at all, or an attempt to minimise it. And the way that we try to counter that is through facts and evidence. The first thing that we did as a campaigning group was to write to race organisers, event organisers, and ask them to actually collect data on the ethnicity of their entrants. because nobody did. So there was some anecdotal idea that maybe black people are underrepresented, but no one could say what the numbers were. But now, a year later, we can. So, you know, I can confidently tell you that while 4.5% of the UK population, as of 2011, so it's probably a bigger number now, are either black or mixed race, white, black, African or Caribbean, only 0.7% of trail race entrants in the UK are black. So there's a big gap there. And once you get that out there, now we're not talking about, is there a problem? Now we're talking about, what do we do to fix the problem, or why is there a problem? And it's not because black people don't like running, that's for sure. So the follow-on from that is that it's necessary for people to be educated, to educate themselves, so that we're not just talking about opinion, we're not just talking about assumptions, we're actually talking about real facts and evidence. And you know, I've experienced that here today already. You know, I listened to the excellent session from Billy Welch, and I learned more in the first 5 minutes of that about the gypsy experience and the history of gypsies than I brought into the room. And I'm kind of ashamed to say that, but that sort of brings me to another point, which is that all of these things are connected. Some of you will be familiar with the term intersectionality, but what I'm talking about here is that there can be no such thing as racial equality for black people if there isn't racial equality for gypsies, if there isn't gender equality, if there isn't equality with regard to sexuality. All of these things are interconnected with each other. One of the things that I've had the privilege to do as a member of Black Trail Runners is talk to some really interesting people for our podcast, which I will promote here. It's The Checkpoint. It's wonderful, available on all podcast platforms. And we had a discussion with an Indigenous American runner, an activist called Jordan Marie Brings Three White Horses Daniel. And she said, and she was talking about climate change, which is kind of current, that there can't be racial justice without climate justice. These things are so inextricably linked. And this is true of all of these things. And what that means is that although you probably maybe sat in a room with lots of privileges, you probably haven't got all of them. So if someone in that room is being denied justice in some way, or representation, or a voice, it's probably diminishing your justice and your representation and your voice too. So if that's not a good enough reason to actually speak up, then I can't think of any better reasons.
It's really interesting we talk about racial justice and climate justice. I see climate justice through a racial lens, if I'm completely honest. And when we look at it from a global perspective, it's quite easy to see that. But I would absolutely echo that, the intersectionality of the global structures, and justice denied, or justice denied for one is justice denied for all of us. And that's me paraphrasing Martin Luther King there. Now, that's the spaces that, or they're ways of disrupting those systems of power. Now, again, I think it was Dan said, or Sonny said, that we all, the people in this room, have real power. And I think we all have a real power that we can go out and do something. I'm just going to run, I was going to say up and down the panel, and just say, if there are some things you'd like people to go away after this conference and actually do, what would they possibly be? And let me start with Hannah, who's the other end of the furthest away from me.
If there was one thing to take away from this, I would say, if you're in an all-white space, if you see all the people around the table are all white, Are you thinking about anti-racism when you're in that space? What aren't you thinking about? Raise that at the time. Speak about it openly. It might be that you're not equipped to do what it is you need to do. You're not informed enough to do what it needs to do, but you've started that conversation. You've opened it up. You're in that all-white space, but you're starting that conversation.
A bit similar, but I would say trust. Trust, if anti-racism isn't something that you're talking about in your organisations, trust that there is somebody else in your organisation that knows that you should be talking about it and wants to talk about it. So create that space, and even if it's one person, 2 people, 300, whatever it is, do it, and trust that change will start to come.
So there's so many things, aren't there? I think this conversation is about our shared humanity at the end of the day, and I think so one of the things that I would suggest would be really important to do is, in acknowledging that, and I mentioned vulnerability at the beginning, you know, step into the space, be brave, and seek out opportunities to be very deliberate about having the conversation with people who you know don't agree with you, and keep doing that.
This is a really difficult question. I would say know when to listen and know when to speak up. So listen when Black people are telling you about their life experience. And when I say listen, what I mean is actually listen. Don't be thinking about how maybe they're not representative, maybe they've overestimated it. This is their experience. Pay attention to it. But then know when to speak. And that's often when someone needs to be challenged. And that's difficult. But the thing that we always tell our allies is that it's fine to make mistakes, as long as you own them, as long as you hear the response and respond appropriately, act differently in future. There's no playbook for this. We're doing things which haven't been done before. So we will undoubtedly get things wrong. We know we do, but we just, you know, a Becker test, we fail again, we fail better, etc. We just try and improve.
Thanks.
I would say don't be on your own. I would say collaborate with other people. So read together, talk about these ideas that you've got with other people, because if you've got a group of people working together, you're more likely to effect change than if you're trying to do it on your own. So working with other people, I would say.
Are we wrapping up? Is that why we're asking this question? Oh, so I'm not going to be brief, I don't think. Because I really wanted to come in on that question about fragility. So we all know what it means when something is fragile. To touch something, it means it could be breakable, it could be sensitive. I think fragility and the white fragility and how you explained it and how others answered it, we've got to understand that we are, as Black people, people of colour, have been in spaces that when we start to challenge, others start to get fragile and sensitive. They start to get angry and upset that we're challenging their privilege. They start to get frustrated that we actually are feeling that we can assert ourselves and assert our right to be. But it's not always easy to challenge. And I guess some of that is because, you know, if anyone's ever read Audre Lorde's essays, she has talked about how we've often self-edited ourselves when we are in spaces that make us feel uncomfortable because we're worried that either it's imposter syndrome that we're going to get or that actually we're going to be shut down. We edit ourselves. We become slightly more passive. We become a bit more withdrawn. We don't speak up because we know that when we say something about racism and about the structures that harm us, maybe somebody around that table, which it may be predominantly white, will turn around and get upset. And when you come from this historical context of having to be submissive, when you look at what enslavement and slavery did, when you look at that toxic legacy that had been left behind, there is an amount of catching up. So we haven't been in positions of power, so we haven't always asserted ourselves for fear of the reprisals or the issues that come and rain themselves down on us. So addressing fragility, again, I would say those who understand, really understand what privilege is and what you have inherited, address it so that others have the same level of access that you do. Socially, economically, you've mentioned climate change. There's so much that we can be doing. So if I answer your question about what do I want people to come away from, this setting, this family and body of people, understand intersectionality. It is not a buzzword or a synonym for diversity. It is a word that was coined by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw. And Professor Kimberly Crenshaw talked about those social categorizations which have been oppressed. When you understand what oppression looks like, you can then start to address some of those root causes. So look at things around critical race theory and intersectionality, because I'm sitting here right now as a Black lesbian working class woman who's also a mother to a 26-year-old, and I know I look really good because I'm nearly 50. But so I'm in the mature bracket, but I don't want to just be sitting here talking about race and only race and leaving my sexual orientation at the door. I don't only want to be talking about sexual orientation and leave my gender at the door. I don't want to just be talking about gender and leaving my class at the door. So all of these things, as you mentioned, are interconnected. So when addressing anti-racism, think about Black women. Think about Black disabled people or differently abled people. Think about Black queer people. Think about Black everything that makes up who we are and address it all. You know, if I'm asked, oh, what do you address first? There's no hierarchy here. You know, we really have got to do better and be better. So you've mentioned listening, active listening, understanding intersectionality. I would say do your homework. You know, Professor has got a lot of books here and there's a lot out there that you can start doing to read and listen to podcasts, like you said, your podcast, what's it called?
The Checkpoint.
Okay, there we go. Shameless plug, but no shameless plug. Let's keep on promoting things. Create a list of things that you can share around your workplace. Create those lists which mean that you can share with young children if you are educators to, as you say, decolonize the curriculum. Put your money where your mouth is. I work globally and I work with the most amazing human rights defenders, some of whom I may not see again because they're navigating laws that criminalize and harm them, which were left there through the British colonization. But what I would say is that you've got to make sure if you bring somebody to the table, even for a conversation, reimburse them for their time. Because anti-racist campaigners, we don't just need exposure, because exposure does not pay the bills. What we need is to be able to pay our rent and still do this work. Because tomorrow, when I'm tired, I can't call into work and say, I'm taking time off because I'm sick, I'm Black. I have to go to work and I still have to be dealing with the issues of racism. So come away from this understanding that Black people will also be tired, will be frustrated, will be exhausted. Question is, how do you show up and show out for them? How do you become that shield when we are tired and can no longer be out there with the placard saying Black Lives Matter, when we can no longer be talking about how racism impacts us? Because your allyship has to be rooted in solidarity. And if it is not rooted in solidarity, then it's not allyship. And I suggest you go back to the drawing board. And lastly, keep on disrupting. We need to usualize the conversation. And I use the word usualize because I don't quite know what normal means, because as a queer woman, I have been called abnormal. So let's usualize the conversation about being anti-racist, not just I'm not racist, about understanding the intersections and also linking it back to the many different things that impact the lives of those who are seen as most marginalized and most vulnerable. And I'll leave it there with my few things for you all.
Well, we are 7 minutes late. I don't apologise at all. But absolute truth to power there. And one thing I would leave you all with is we come to this world, all of us come to this world, and when we leave it, I would always sit down and evaluate how have you left this world better. With all of the power and the opportunities that you have, how are you going to go out into this world and leave the world better? And I'd absolutely echo the intersectionality there. There is no hierarchy of harm here. Harm is harm, and to be better, we need to be better. Thank you very much, everyone.